The ballroom glowed the way a memory does, soft around the edges, forgiving in the middle. A pianist kept the room breathing in slow, even phrases, while candlelight skipped across glassware and white orchids trailed like lace. I stood with a champagne flute I hadn't tasted, watching a giant screen wait for its cue like a closed curtain. Evan squeezed my hand, too warm, too confident, and offered the kind of smile you practice in mirrors. Across the room, Leia turned under the chandelier, the silk at her shoulders catching every bit of light like it belonged to her. Mason lingered near the exit like a man who had already made peace with a hard truth. I took the microphone, and the crowd hushed the way they do when they think they're about to hear a love story. They were in a way just not the kind anyone dresses up for. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if stories where the truth wins have a place in your night tap, like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest, because this is how a quiet woman chooses justice. My name is Taylor, and until that night, I would have told you my life in a string of small, steady comforts. A craftsman house on a tree-lined street in East Nashville, a porch that smelled like rain, and a job that let me hold children's futures in my careful hands. I grew up in a home where we did not mistake kindness for weakness. My mother taught me that calm is a tool you use on days when people try to take your voice. Evan and I had been married 6 years together for 9, and we did the little things that make two people feel like teammates. His coffee mugs on the bottom shelf for my reach. My reminders stuck to his monitor when deadlines piled up. We saved for a fall trip to Italy, scrolled photos of tiled rooftops at night, and kept our spare change in a jar that made the plan feel tangible. It wasn't a fairy tale, just a life that fit like a favorite sweater. Leia slid into that life so easily, it felt predestined. We met freshman year when dorm rooms smelled like detergent and borrowed perfume, and we outlasted bad apartments, worse bosses, and men who never learned how to apologize. She stood at my side when Evan proposed. I stood at hers when she flashed the ring Mason gave her, both of us, half crying, half laughing, in the way only women who remember each other at 19 can. Mason was the quiet, kind, steady voice, practical shoes, the look of someone who counts to 5 before he speaks. The 4 of us settled into a rhythm that made weekends feel like a script farmer's market on Saturdays, home-cooked dinners on Sundays, a calendar of small excuses to keep loving simple. What I remember most about that time is the stillness, how normal life can be right up until it isn't. There were hairline fractures I didn't call by their names. Evan tilting his phone away when it buzzed, Leia canceling last minute with reasons too thin to hold weight. A glance between them that lasted a beat longer than courtesy. I filed each moment where women keep things they aren't ready to touch near the sternum behind the wishing. I told myself that long marriages make strange weather, that busy seasons make good people sloppy. The truth is, I believed my history with them protected me from the future with them. On good days, we planned Rome first, then Florence, maybe Venice, if the flights made sense. Evan hummed while he shaved, filling the bathroom with steam and confidence, and I packed my days with checkups and vaccinations and parents learning to breathe through worry. On Sunday nights, we left phones in a bowl by the door as if that gesture alone could make us honest. Leia and Mason often joined, bringing a good bottle and a story from a venue she'd styled a rooftop he was renovating, a couple whose vows had made everyone cry. I polished the wine glasses and thought, as I often did, that some people are just blessed in clusters. A single moment can bend the whole arc of a life, and you don't recognize it until you hear the sound it makes on the way down. Mine arrived like a small, ordinary sound, a bathroom fan, and the hiss of water behind a half-closed door on a gray Tuesday afternoon. I set my bag on the kitchen counter and stood very still, listening to a house I thought I knew answer me back. When the shower cut off, the silence felt shaped like something had been carved out of it. That was the last quiet minute before I learned how much damage 2 people can do on a weekday. I wish I could tell you. I sensed the exact moment when the ground began to shift. But all I knew then was the cool of the hallway floor under my shoes and the way fear tries to rearrange itself as doubt. I told myself I was tired, told myself nothing was wrong except the kind of wrong you sleep off. What I walked toward wasn't an argument or a spectacle. It was a fact with a pulse. The truth doesn't shout when it's real. It waits patient as a steady drip. The day it all began was as ordinary as any Tuesday could be. The sky was heavy with low gray clouds, and I left the clinic later than planned, still carrying the faint smell of disinfectant on my clothes. My last patient had pressed a crayon drawing into my hand, a portrait of me with a stethoscope stretched twice my size, and I had tucked it carefully into my bag. I remember thinking I'd hang it on the refrigerator when I got home, just to remind myself that even on long days, some small things were worth saving. Evan had texted that morning saying he'd be at the office late for a quarterly review, so I expected the house to be quiet when I turned into our driveway. His car sitting there unsettled me in ways I couldn't yet name. I told myself maybe the meeting ended early. Maybe he wanted to surprise me with dinner. But the front door was unlocked, and the silence inside carried a different weight. A faint trace of his cologne lingered in the hallway, warm and musky, and from somewhere down the corridor came the hiss of running water. I called his name, my voice sounding strange to my own ears as it echoed back from the walls. The shower was running in the hall bathroom, not the master where we kept our things. The sound of it filled the space like static, too loud and too wrong. When the water shut off suddenly, I froze. The door creaked, and then he stepped out, a towel around his waist hair damp, a bead of water sliding across his shoulder. "Surprise," he said, but his smile looked forced, pasted on too quickly. It wasn't his words that broke me. It was the vibration on the vanity behind him. His phone lit up with a message he hadn't hidden fast enough. The name glowing on the screen was hers, Leia. My closest friend, my maid of honor, the woman who'd stood beside me through half my life. The preview was a photo, our bed, our sheets, and her hand resting there. A pale hand with a crescent scar near her thumb, one I had seen 1,000 times while handing her glasses of wine, while painting our nails together in dorm rooms years ago. Unmistakable. He moved too quickly, reaching for the phone, but it clattered to the tile and slid to my feet. My hand was steady as I picked it up, but inside it felt like something sharp had lodged beneath my ribs. He stammered, "I can explain," and it almost made me laugh. "There isn't an explanation for a hand in your marriage bed." My voice was even when I asked, "Who else knows?" He answered too quickly. "No one," and I saw it. The blink. I had learned to count over the years. 1, 2, 3, 4. Always 4 when he lied. That was when I realized this wasn't an accident. Mistakes don't arrive with patterns. Patterns are made by choice. His face showed not shame, but irritation, as if I'd caught him at something inconvenient. I walked past him, set the phone on the counter, and washed my hands like they were sticky. My wedding ring caught on the towel, digging into my skin, until it stung, as if asking whether I still belonged where I was standing. He hovered in the doorway, repeating himself. "It's nothing, Taylor. It doesn't mean anything." But there it was, proof that it meant everything. I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream or demand answers because I already knew what the answers would be. Leia would have her script ready, a drunken mistake, a weak moment, words rehearsed for sympathy. Evan would add to it, reshaping each lie until even he believed it. I thought, instead of the small boy who'd handed me his crayon drawing earlier, of how trust looks simple until it's broken. That picture was already hanging on my refrigerator, its bright colors almost defiant against the dark knowledge that now sat between us. We ate dinner at the same table, though I hardly tasted the food. I sat beside him on the couch, afterward body language, loose voice, light enough to convince him the storm had passed. He relaxed into it, relieved, believing I had chosen to look away. But I wasn't forgiving him. I was studying him. Every gesture, every pause, every unguarded habit. I mapped his routines as carefully as I charted a patient's recovery, noting where he faltered, where the seams showed. He went to bed early, his breathing steady beside me, while I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The next morning, I woke with a clarity that felt colder than grief. I made coffee the way I always did, listening to the sound of him humming at the sink, pretending the world hadn't shifted. My phone sat on the counter, the crayon drawing still held by a magnet behind it, and I knew who I needed to call. Not my sister, not my mother, not even one of my colleagues. There was only one other person who deserved to know the truth. Leia's fiancé, Mason. My fingers hovered over the screen before I typed 3 words. "We need coffee." His reply came almost instantly. "Name the place." I wrote back, "Barista Parlor." 10 a.m. By the time I parked outside the cafe, my decision had hardened into something unshakable. I wasn't going to let them sweep this away with apologies. I wasn't going to play the role of the quiet, wounded wife. I was going to make them remember what they had done, and Mason, he was the only one who could stand beside me when the time came. Inside, the smell of roasted beans filled the air, and sunlight cut a sharp line across the wooden tables. Mason was waiting in the back corner, posture casual, but eyes alert, as though he'd been expecting this moment all along. I slid into the seat opposite him and placed my phone on the table, the image still unopened, but undeniable. He studied it with a measured inhale, not shock, but confirmation. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Long enough to have a routine," I said. He nodded once, the muscle in his jaw tightening, and then he looked directly at me. "Then this isn't about confronting them," he said. "This is about ending them." I met his gaze, my voice steady. "I want them to lose something they can't get back, and I want it to fit the crime." His expression shifted just enough to show agreement. "Then we build a stage," he answered. The plan wasn't yet formed, but the spark had caught. We sat there in silence for a while, 2 people tethered, not by love, but by betrayal, already beginning to imagine the performance that would strip everything bare. When I walked out of that cafe, the air felt sharper, as if the city itself knew what we were about to do. Mason and I weren't friends, not in the way couples usually mix, but in that moment, we became something more dangerous. Partners in ruin. The thought didn't scare me. It steadied me. I wasn't going to cry into a pillow or wait for them to decide when the story was finished. I was going to write the ending myself. And as I turned the key in my car, the weight of what I carried shifted from sorrow to resolve. The first crack had opened wide, and the pieces were already moving into place. What came next would not be loud or messy. It would be quiet, deliberate, and unforgettable. That was the morning I understood the difference between discovering betrayal and choosing what to do with it. And as I drove away from that cafe, I knew the life Evan and Leia thought they had built was already beginning to collapse. The only question left was how precise we could be in bringing it down. That night, after meeting Mason, I slipped back into my routine as if nothing had changed. Evan was already home pouring wine and acting like the version of himself I once trusted without question. He set the glasses on the counter and offered bright lilies, the kind of flowers he'd never bought me before. I smiled, thanked him, and set them in a vase, but inside I was weighing every word, every movement, like a woman measuring fault lines in her own house. I listened as he talked about our Italy trip again, his voice lighter, more hopeful, as though he could speak the fracture out of existence.
I nodded in all the right places, but what I carried now was stronger than his rehearsed charm.
After dinner, he reached for me with familiar ease, brushing a hand against mine as if nothing had ever shifted. I let him think he was winning ground back, allowed his confidence to build, and all the while, my mind was mapping his tells. His blink pattern, the way he sipped too quickly, when pressed the casual deflections that came just a second too late. I wasn't looking for reassurance anymore. I was looking for confirmation proof that my instincts were correct. He thought he was repairing us, but what he didn't see was that I was already laying out a blueprint for the undoing. Later, when he went to bed, I stayed awake in the living room with my laptop glowing faintly in the dark. I searched for public camera feeds near Leia's apartment complex, places where I could observe without leaving fingerprints. It didn't take long to spot what I needed: clear angles from the street enough to capture entrances and exits. I marked the timestamp and closed the screen when I heard him stir upstairs. My heart pounded, but not from guilt. It was the steady rhythm of someone who knew patience would deliver everything. The next morning, I tested him. I mentioned casually over breakfast that I might take on an extra shift the following Thursday. He froze only for a breath before replying, "Of course, we'll just move date night." He covered the pause with a sip of coffee, but I caught the way his hand lingered on the mug longer than usual. That hesitation was worth more than any confession. It told me Thursday nights weren't random. They were scheduled sacred in their own selfish way, and that made them predictable. Leia underestimated me differently. She believed history would protect her, that our years of friendship would shield her from scrutiny. She still texted me photos of dresses for her engagement party, still asked about catering menus, still called me forever family. I played along, sending back opinions, laughing in the right places, even meeting her for lunch one afternoon. She hugged me at the door, smelling of expensive perfume and sweetness, her face painted in practiced concern. "How are you?" she asked, eyes wide, voice soft. "I'm good," I said, and for the first time in weeks, I meant it in a way she would never understand. Halfway through the meal, her phone buzzed against the table. She flipped it quickly, but not before I saw the letter E flash across the preview. She smiled as if it were nothing, brushed it off with a dismissive work, and went on about floral arrangements. I matched her smile, told her she deserved something like that, and watched as she completely missed the shift in my eyes. She believed she was safe inside the walls of my loyalty. What she didn't realize was that I had already torn those walls down. That evening, I met Mason in a downtown office space. He managed one of those half-empty buildings where the walls felt thick enough to hide anything. We sat across from each other at a long table, papers spread between us, like two strategists in the middle of a quiet war. "We've got our pattern," I told him. "Thursday nights without fail." He nodded, his expression sharp, then leaned back in his chair. "Good. Then all we need is the right stage." We spoke in low voices, sketching out the first outlines of what would become our plan. He suggested an engagement celebration, something that looked innocent, even generous. I agreed. They would think it was an olive branch, an attempt at healing. They would walk into that room expecting applause, expecting to be celebrated. Instead, they would face their reflection in front of everyone who mattered most. Mason promised he could secure the venue without raising suspicion. I promised I'd have the evidence ready. Neither of us smiled. This wasn't about satisfaction. It was about inevitability. In the weeks that followed, the mask became my closest ally. I laughed at Evan's jokes, teased him about his clumsy attempts at cooking, even sat with him while he researched rooftop restaurants in Florence. I smiled when Leia called, pretended to be touched by her updates, pretended to be the friend I once was. Inside, though, I kept building my file: photos, timestamps, receipts, and screen captures, each one tucked carefully away, like pieces of a puzzle only I could assemble. One Thursday evening, I decided to test the waters more boldly. I told Evan I had a yoga class across town and left the house with a takeout cup of coffee. Instead of mats and candles, I parked across from Laya's apartment complex and waited. At exactly 7:12 p.m., Evan walked through the lobby doors, checking his watch like a man who knew exactly where he belonged. I noted every detail: the jacket he wore, the way he ran a hand through his hair, the faint smirk when he glanced at his phone. He didn't look around once. That was his mistake. The next week, I followed from a safer distance as he slipped into a boutique hotel on Division Street. My pulse hammered, but I kept my stride steady, just another woman walking home from errands. I caught my reflection in a shop window and realized I didn't look like someone spying. I looked like someone who already knew. That image gave me strength. The power of knowing was sharper than any confrontation could ever be. At home, he was lighter on those days, humming, offering me wine, making gestures that would have once melted me. I matched him with ease, slipping into the role of the forgiving wife, while inside I was counting down. Every lie he told was another brick in the foundation of what I was building. Every Thursday night was another nail in the coffin of his illusion. The grief was still there, though buried beneath the precision. Some nights, when the house was quiet and I stared at the refrigerator with that crayon drawing still pinned in place, the ache came back. Not for him, not for Leia, but for the version of myself who had believed without hesitation. For the mornings when I thought love was permanent, for the weekends that felt safe. I mourned that woman in silence. She was gone, and in her place was someone harder, sharper, quieter. Mason and I continued to meet in secret, our conversations shifting from discovery to construction. He arranged for discreet technicians who wouldn't ask questions, men who cared more about cash than curiosity. I handed him my growing folder of evidence, each page a layer they couldn't explain away. We tested our timing, rehearsed our roles, and with every passing day, I felt the weight of sorrow turn into something else entirely. Not joy, not vengeance, but certainty. Evan and Leia thought they had stolen something from me, my trust, my dignity, my history. What they didn't understand was that by underestimating me, they had given me the one thing they couldn't take back: time to prepare. And as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that the silence I carried wasn't weakness. It was my weapon. The weeks of quiet watching had worn me thin, but they had also carved out a new kind of steadiness in me. I no longer doubted what I had seen. I no longer wondered if maybe I had imagined something that wasn't there. The pattern was too consistent, their routine too polished to be coincidence. Each Thursday, Evan left home with the same line about late meetings, the same easy smile, and I had the footage to match. I didn't need his confession. I had the truth in my own hands, and that changed everything. One evening, Mason and I met in a conference room he kept empty in one of his developments downtown. The place smelled faintly of drywall dust, the kind of unfinished scent that clings to new construction. He set 2 coffees on the table and opened a folder. Inside were calendar pages printed in black and white with Thursday evenings neatly blocked out. "We can use this," he said, his voice low but certain. I slid my phone across to him, showing the still frames I'd captured Evan walking into Leia's apartment building, his hand brushing against her back as though it belonged there. Mason nodded once. We didn't have to speak the rest aloud. The stage was forming. He suggested the Hermitage, a hotel he often used for corporate gatherings. A private ballroom could be rented under the pretense of a celebration. An engagement party, he said, looking up at me. For them, hosted by us. The thought caught me off guard at first, but the longer I sat with it, the more it fit. They would expect reconciliation, some attempt at repair, and they would come dressed for admiration. They would bring friends and family, the very people whose approval they had counted on for years. And that was exactly the audience I wanted. I spent the next week gathering more than just images. I pulled receipts Evan left scattered on the counter, checked credit card statements tucked into his briefcase, and photographed hotel charges under a name that wasn't quite his own, but close enough to their inside joke. Each piece was small, ordinary even, but together they told a story that couldn't be dismissed. Mason, careful as always, stored duplicates in places only he could access. I trusted him in a way I hadn't trusted anyone in years, not because I wanted to, but because betrayal had already stripped away every other option. Back at home, Evan carried on with his rehearsed affection. He suggested we look at flights to Rome, spoke about Florence as if he were studying travel guides in secret. I sat beside him on the couch, leaning close enough to let him believe. He pointed out rooftop bars and narrow cobblestone streets, his voice carrying the same confidence he used in boardrooms. I smiled at the right times, kissed his cheek when he turned toward me, and excused myself when I needed space. What he didn't know was that I left the room not to breathe, but to check emails from Mason. Reservations confirmed, AV team secured, a list of equipment tucked neatly into my inbox like a promise. When I met Laya for lunch that Friday, she was radiant in a champagne-colored blouse, her hair styled in loose waves that caught the light. She spoke about floral arrangements for her engagement, about colors she thought would suit the season. Her phone buzzed twice during the meal, and she turned it over quickly each time. I stirred my drink, let my smile hold steady, and told her how beautiful she looked when she talked about love. She seemed relieved, as if she had been afraid I might suspect. That relief was my cover, and I held it carefully. By then, Mason and I were meeting twice a week. We chose places no one would think to connect to us, a storage loft above a bakery, a nearly empty showroom, even a park bench in the early morning. Each time we reviewed our progress like surgeons preparing for a procedure. He handled logistics with precision, guest lists, invitations, catering orders that sounded extravagant enough to distract but not so elaborate that they raised questions. I supplied the evidence, labeled and dated each file tucked into duplicate USB drives. Nothing was left to chance. One evening, Mason spread the seating chart across the table between us. He marked where Laya's parents would sit, where Evan's boss and colleagues would be, where friends from their inner circle would have the clearest view of the screen. The point, he said quietly, is not just exposure. It's permanence. We want them to understand there's no path back. I nodded, pressing my hand flat against the paper. It was the first time I realized how calm I felt in the middle of all this. Calm and certain. At home that night, Evan tried again to close the distance between us. He poured wine, spoke about how he believed the upcoming party would be good for everyone, a way to move forward. I swirled my glass, listened to the clink of liquid against the stem, and told him I thought he was right. He smiled, relieved again, never suspecting he was agreeing to his own undoing. That was his flaw, believing silence meant forgiveness. He never considered it could mean preparation. The days leading up to the event were filled with details only I knew the weight of. I arranged for a makeup artist, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to look untouchable in the moment I took everything from them. I packed each USB in a different place, my clutch, Mason's jacket, and a decoy gift bag meant for the happy couple. I checked my purse 3 times before leaving the house, steadying my breath each time I felt the cool plastic at my fingertips. 2 nights before the event, Mason arranged for us to test the equipment in the empty ballroom. The chandeliers glowed above rows of chairs, the polished wood carrying the faint scent of lemon and dust. We stood at the console with Jeff, the lead technician, as I plugged in one of the drives. The screen filled first with the decoy slideshow, smiling group photos, vacations, dinners that looked ordinary and safe. Then, at my signal, the images shifted. Evan entering Leia's building. Leia's hand tangled in my sheets. Receipts, dates, patterns too precise to be explained away. The silence of that empty room pressed around me heavy and final. Jeff only nodded. "Timing's clean," he said. "No lag. It'll run smooth." I went home that night with my chest tight, not from nerves, but from anticipation. Every detail was locked into place, every backup secured. Evan was waiting when I came in, pouring 2 glasses of wine, as if he'd planned something tender. He spoke again about Italy, about how maybe this trip could be our new beginning. I set my bag down carefully, smiled, and told him it sounded perfect. In a way, it did, but not for the reasons he thought. The morning before the event, I woke before dawn. The house was still, the air heavy with the kind of quiet that makes your heartbeat feel louder than usual. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, my checklist folded neatly beside me. USB drives, seating chart, timing signals. Every item confirmed, every backup accounted for. Evan walked in, then kissed the top of my head and said, "Tomorrow's going to be perfect." I looked up at him steady and answered, "It will be." The morning of the event arrived warm and bright, the kind of June day that made the whole city soften. I moved through my house like a woman rehearsing a dance, each step deliberate, each detail already memorized. Evan was cheerful, humming as he shaved, speaking lightly about how the evening would be good for everyone. He kissed me on the cheek, oblivious to the weight I carried in my purse, a folded seating chart, a backup USB drive tucked beneath the lining, and a signal card marked with times. My reflection in the mirror looked calm, but inside, I counted every hour like it was part of a clock winding down. By noon, the Hermitage ballroom was nearly ready. The chandeliers glowed against polished wood floors, rows of tables dressed in white linen's orchids, trailing down in delicate streams. Gold flatware glinted against the light, every detail chosen to disguise what the night would hold. Mason greeted the catering staff, his voice, even his movements practiced. He looked up when I entered, gave a small nod, and I knew then that every piece of the plan was intact. Jeff, the AV technician, adjusted cables near the stage, his hand rising in a subtle wave to let me know the system was live. Guests began to arrive at 7 sharp, their laughter mingling with the soft clink of champagne flutes. Evan walked beside me, his navy suit crisp, the same one he had worn during our rehearsal dinner years ago. He carried himself like a man stepping into a second chance, and he held my hand with the quiet confidence of someone who thought forgiveness was already his. Leia entered minutes later, draped in a champagne-colored gown, her hair curled perfectly at her shoulders. She crossed the room with a smile too polished to be casual and hugged me tightly, her perfume clinging to my dress. "Thank you for this," she whispered. "It means more than you know." I smiled back, just enough, the words sitting heavy in my chest. The room filled quickly, a mix of family, friends, and colleagues. Mason moved among them with quiet precision, greeting each person, ensuring that those whose opinions carried weight were seated in the best positions to view the screen. Leia's parents found their place near the front, Evan's boss, not far behind colleagues clustered in small groups along the center tables. The hum of conversation rose and fell, softening only when the lights dimmed. Evan leaned closer, squeezed my hand once, and whispered, "We've made it back." His voice carried such certainty that for one moment I almost felt the echo of who we had been. But the screen behind me reminded me why I was here. I stepped onto the stage, the microphone cool in my hand, the chatter fading until the room was still. Tonight is about love, loyalty, and the people who make us who we are. I began, my voice steady, my gaze sweeping the room. The first slides filled the screen, smiling photographs from dinners, vacations, celebrations, faces familiar to everyone seated there. The room softened, laughter rippling at familiar memories, the atmosphere warm and trusting. I gave a small signal to Jeff. The screen went black, and the next image appeared. A sharp gasp broke the silence. It was a photograph of Leia's hand tangled in my sheets, the scar near her thumb plain for anyone to see. More images followed in sequence, Evan entering her apartment complex, the timestamp burning in the corner. Another frame, both of them walking into the boutique hotel on Division Street. His hand pressed against the small of her back. The room shifted murmurs, breaking into stunned whispers, the scrape of chairs as people leaned closer to see. Evan's grip on my hand turned rigid. "Taylor," he muttered under his breath, "stop this." I pulled away gently, my eyes never leaving the crowd. "I thought you should see what loyalty looks like to some people," I said, the microphone catching my words in a voice calmer than I felt. Leia's face drained of color, her eyes darting across the room as if searching for an escape. Mason stepped easily into her path, a fresh glass of champagne in hand. "Leaving so soon," he asked, his tone casual, his smile thin. The evidence rolled on receipts from dinners, hotel bookings under a name linked to their private joke, screenshots of messages blurred just enough to protect numbers, but clear enough to prove intimacy. Each slide was timed perfectly, one blow after another, too precise to refute. In the front row, Leia's father stood abruptly, his voice cutting across the murmurs. "Is this true?" he demanded, his words trembling with fury. She said nothing. Her silence rang louder than any denial could. Evan stepped forward, raising his hands in protest. "This is being taken out of context," he said. His voice strained, but the next slide silenced him completely. It was a photo of him and Leia kissing in the lobby of her building, time-stamped on the same night I had been home, making dinner for him. His protest withered, and the air in the room turned sharp. Someone whispered, "Oh, my God!" Another voice followed, low and bitter. "Unbelievable." Phones appeared in hands recording, documenting. The final slide lingered longer than the rest, a split screen of two calendars, his and hers, both with Thursdays blocked out, marked with identical private codes. The pattern was undeniable, the lie too deep to unravel. Then the lights returned, and the room filled with the restless murmur of people digesting what they had seen. Some stood to leave, others shook their heads, conversations breaking into clusters of disbelief. I turned toward Evan, my voice low enough only for him. "You told me no one knew. Now everyone does." His face was ashen, his confidence shattered. As guests filed out, Mason's team moved quickly, handing discreet envelopes to select individuals. Evan's boss received one, Leia's employer, another. Investors tucked theirs away with stern faces. Inside each was a dossier of the same evidence, printed and bound, impossible to deny. By the time Evan stepped outside into the humid Nashville night, 3 missed calls lit up his phone. Leia's buzzed endlessly in her clutch messages from colleagues, friends, and family already circling. At the curb, Evan caught up to me, his voice sharp. "You've destroyed us." I turned to him, my expression even. "No. You destroyed yourself. I just made sure no one could pretend otherwise." Leia emerged behind him, her eyes red but her jaw clenched as though she wanted to bargain. I didn't give her the chance. I raised my voice just enough for those still nearby to hear. "Check your phones." Notifications pinged across the crowd as people opened an email I had scheduled hours earlier. A video appeared, a security feed of Evan and Leia leaving her apartment, time-stamped 2 hours before my bridal shower. The crowd erupted in disbelief, some swearing, some laughing bitterly, others shaking their heads. Leia's father turned away without a word. Evan's shoulders sagged, the last of his bravado gone. I stepped into the waiting car. Mason had arranged the door, closing softly behind me. Through the glass, I watched the two of them standing side by side, no longer lovers hiding in shadows, but liars exposed in the harshest light. They looked smaller than I had ever seen them. By morning, the storm had already begun to spread. I woke to a phone that wouldn't stop vibrating messages from friends, screenshots from coworkers, and links to posts that were multiplying across every platform. The video from the ballroom had traveled faster than I could have imagined, passed from hand to hand until it seemed the entire city had seen it. The captions varied, some cruel, some matter-of-fact, but all of them pointed to the same truth. There was no undoing what had been revealed. Evan wasn't in our bed when I came downstairs, but his car was still in the driveway. The guest room door stood ajar. The sheets twisted the air inside, carrying the faint trace of his cologne. On the kitchen counter sat his phone, buzzing every few seconds with incoming calls. His boss's name flashed more than once, followed by numbers I didn't recognize, and then messages from his sister. I didn't touch it. Some punishments worked best without interference, and I wanted him to face every unanswered call for what it was. Mason called around noon. His voice was calm, but there was a note of satisfaction that matched the weight in my chest. "It started," he said simply. "Evan's been pulled off his biggest account. His boss sent out a memo about personal conduct, and it's already circulating internally." He paused before continuing. "And Leia, she's been placed on leave. Clients are calling it a public relations nightmare." I closed my eyes, letting the words settle. It wasn't joy I felt, but the certainty of a balance being restored. That afternoon, I walked into the clinic as if it were any other day. My colleagues greeted me warmly, some with looks that lingered just a moment longer than usual. No one asked directly, but I could sense they already knew. The beauty of precision was that I hadn't needed to defend myself. The evidence had spoken on its own, and now the story was telling itself without me lifting another finger. I moved from room to room with steady hands, checking heartbeats, adjusting medications, listening to parents breathe out their fears. The world had tilted in one part of my life, but in another, I was exactly who I had always been. By evening, the ripples had widened. Leia's father announced publicly that the engagement was off, his voice, measured but firm, when he made the statement. Avon's business partner issued a notice that access to company accounts had been suspended pending review. Their lives, once carefully arranged, were beginning to unravel thread by thread. I slept soundly that night, deeper than I had in weeks, the silence of the house no longer heavy, but freeing. 2 days later, Evan tried to speak to me. He appeared in the kitchen in sweatpants, his hair uncombed, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. "We can fix this," he said quietly, his voice cracking under the weight of his own desperation. "If you take it down, if you tell people it's not what it looks like." I set my mug down slowly, the ceramic cool against my palm. "Evan." I answered, my tone steady. I didn't put it up. I just let it exist. His shoulders slumped, his mouth tightening. "You've ruined me," he said. I met his eyes without flinching. "No, you ruined yourself. I just made sure no one could look away." His silence was heavy, but it wasn't regret I saw in his face. It was calculation, the look of a man who had always believed he could negotiate his way out of anything. When he left the room, I didn't follow. There was nothing left to discuss. Leia's attempts came differently. First, a text that simply read, "We need to talk." I ignored it. Later, a longer message arrived. "You've made your point. Please don't destroy everything." I stared at the screen, the words almost laughable in their self-pity. She wasn't apologizing for what she had done. She was asking me to soften the blow of her own undoing. I let the message sit unanswered until the screen went dark. By the end of that week, venues she had contacted for weddings stopped returning her calls. Mutual friends quietly removed them from gatherings, unwilling to stand in the shadow of their scandal. Even people who had never cared much for me respected the way I had handled it. I hadn't shouted or thrown anything. I had simply held up a mirror, and they had crumbled under their own reflection. The twist came a week later, just as the noise seemed to settle. I was leaving the clinic when Mason called, his voice tighter than usual.
"Thought you'd want to hear this from me before it spreads," he said.
Evan tried to get ahead of the story.
"Sold a version to a gossip site, claimed you faked the evidence, that it was all doctored to make him and Leia look bad."
I laughed once, short and sharp.
"And they published it."
"They did," Mason said, "but here's the part you'll like. Jeff sent them the raw files. Chain of custody, timestamps, original formats. Every byte proves it's real." I pictured Evan reading the follow-up headline, the one confirming there had been no fabrication. The irony of him digging his own hole deeper didn't escape me. Mason continued, his voice carrying a rare edge of satisfaction.
"Turns out, in trying to clear his name, he broke his non-disclosure with a client. They're suing."
I stood there in the fading sunlight, listening to traffic move along the street, the weight of it all pressing gently against me. The plan I had carried so carefully had ended the night of the party, but their unraveling now belonged entirely to them. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch. The air smelled of honeysuckle, the neighborhood alive with the sound of distant laughter and children playing past their bedtime. I thought about how hard they had tried to recover Evan, scrambling to rewrite the story, Leia trying to negotiate mercy she hadn't earned. In the end, they hadn't needed me to finish them. They had found ways to collapse all on their own, and that was the cleanest victory of all. The weeks after the ballroom exposure reshaped everything. What had once been whispered only in shadows was now stamped into the open, and there was no path for Evan or Leia to retreat quietly. Their jobs, their reputations, even their closest ties had turned against them. My own house felt different too, less like a place to hide grief and more like a front row seat to their unraveling. Every day seemed to bring some new consequence, and each one carried a weight I hadn't needed to lift myself. Evan tried hardest at first. He moved through the house with restless energy, pacing rooms as if strategy lived in the corners. Calls that had once come with confidence now ended quickly, his tone defensive, clipped. His phone rarely left his hand, but the sound of his voice told me all I needed. Partners were distancing, accounts closed, and what he had built over years was slipping through his fingers in a matter of days. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, his shoulders curved inward like he was bracing against something invisible. I stood at the sink, washing dishes in steady rhythm, and neither of us spoke. The silence between us carried more than words could. Leia's collapse came differently. Where Evan scrambled to fight, she tried to mend. Messages trickled in through mutual friends, pleas for me to meet with her, promises that she only needed a chance to explain. I ignored them all. Her tone shifted from soft to sharp when silence met her at every turn. Screenshots reached me through colleagues' words she had written about me with a bitterness that sounded more desperate than cruel. Even her family had closed ranks, her father's disappointment a wound she couldn't cover. For someone who had thrived on appearances, the absence of her stage left her hollow. The lawsuit against Evan's firm tightened next. Mason called one afternoon, his voice steady as always. His NDA breach gave them the opening they needed, he explained. The suit's been filed, and his partners won't stand by him this time. I sat at my desk at the clinic, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights above me, and felt the finality in his words. Evan had always believed contracts and clients would insulate him from consequence. Now, the very world he trusted was turning its weight against him. At home, he began to retreat into silence. The confident tone that once filled our mornings was gone, replaced by long hours shut in the study. Papers scattered across his desk, emails unanswered, his reflection in the window, more tired each day. Once, I caught him looking at our wedding photograph, his hand pressed flat against the frame, as though he could push time backward. When he noticed me in the doorway, he set it down quickly and muttered,
You don't have to enjoy this. My voice was quiet when I answered. I don't, but I also don't regret it. He had no reply. Leia tried one final gesture. A letter arrived handwritten in looping script I knew too well. She called me forever family again, insisted that what had happened was a mistake, grown too large, and begged me to help her rebuild. I read it once, folded it back into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer of my nightstand. The weight of it stayed there, but the words no longer had power. She had chosen her path, and the distance she found at the end of it belonged entirely to her. Outside of them, my life began to steady. At the clinic, parents thanked me for my care. Children drew me pictures, and colleagues treated me with the quiet respect of people who understood without needing details. Mason and I still spoke occasionally, though less now that the storm had passed its peak. When we did, our conversations were brief, practical updates about outcomes neither of us needed to force. The alliance we had formed was built from betrayal, but it had carried both of us to a place where truth had spoken louder than rage. Evan's breaking point came on a Sunday evening. He stood in the living room with a half-packed suitcase, his expression stripped of the arrogance he had once worn so easily. I can't stay here anymore, he said, simply, his voice flat. I nodded, saying nothing, because there was nothing left that required words. He left the house without looking back, the sound of the door closing behind him, both heavy and final. I didn't watch him drive away. Some endings don't need witnesses. The house was quiet that night, but it wasn't the silence of grief anymore. It was a clean silence, the kind that comes when everything false has finally been stripped away. I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the air smelling faintly of cut grass and summer rain. For the first time in months, I breathed without feeling a weight pressing against my chest. Their worlds had collapsed in public, but mine had steadied in private. Justice had been served not by my hand, but by the truth that refused to stay hidden. When Evan walked out with his suitcase, I didn't feel triumph or even anger. What filled the house that evening was a kind of stillness I hadn't known in months, a silence free of secrets. The porch light flickered against the fading dusk, and I sat there listening to the crickets rise in the grass, knowing that chapter had finally closed. I didn't need to watch where he went. Some departures are best left unseen. Leia never came back into my life, though I heard pieces of her story through others. She left her job, moved away quietly, and faded from the circles we once shared. For someone who thrived on being seen, that silence was its own punishment. Mason, who had stood steady through the worst of it, found his own way forward. He didn't need revenge anymore. He needed space to rebuild. We parted as allies, not friends in the usual sense, but as two people who had carried one another across a fire and walked out on the other side. As for me, life began to steady in ways I hadn't expected. At the clinic, I returned to the rhythm of my work, listening to worried parents, kneeling to speak eye to eye with children, feeling the pulse of something simple and good. My colleagues treated me with quiet respect, not pity, and that distinction mattered. Home felt different, lighter, and when I looked at the crayon drawing still pinned to the refrigerator, it no longer reminded me of loss. It reminded me of endurance, of the trust I still had to offer to those who deserved it. There were moments of grief, yes, nights when I lay awake wondering how people I had loved so deeply could have chosen deception over loyalty. But grief softened with time, and what remained was clarity. Evan and Leia had destroyed themselves through choices made in secret, believing no one would ever see. My role was simply to bring light into the places they thought would stay dark. Justice didn't come from shouting or breaking things. It came from precision, from truth, and from refusing to look away
when the evidence was in my hands. The lesson I carried wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity. I learned that silence is not weakness, that patience can be sharper than anger, and that when someone shows you who they are, it is not your duty to protect their mask. We cannot stop betrayal from touching our lives, but we can decide what we will do with it. In choosing calm, I found strength I didn't know I had. Months later, I walked through my home on a quiet Sunday morning, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors. The house was peaceful again, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had. I poured my coffee, opened the porch door, and breathed in the scent of honeysuckle drifting from down the block. The air felt like it belonged to me again, and with it, the life I had rebuilt from ashes. Before we close, I'd love to know if you've ever carried a hurt that changed you. How did you find your way back to yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.